A dynasty that tried to unite a fractured Europe through bloodlines rather than war, only to be undone by the very forces it sought to control. Nationalism, faith, and time itself. They began not in a palace but in a castle barely clinging to the Alps. What gave them the audacity to dream of emperors? The smell of smoke and bronze still lingers here. Not from a battlefield, but from a burning idea. They were never meant to rule. No prophecy named them. No bloodline ordained them. So how did a family of minor Swiss nobles, barely more than glorified border guards, go on to rule half the known world for nearly 700 years? This is the story of the Habsburg Empire. A story of ambition stitched with silk and sealed with blood. Of thrones taken not by sword, but by marriage. Of kings who ruled in marble palaces yet died in exile and silence. What if I told you, the greatest empire in Europe was never built to last? History doesn't repeat itself, but it does punish those who ignore it. If you've made it this far and haven't subscribed, ask yourself, would you have turned away when empires rose from the ashes? Would you have looked the other way as kings were crowned and kingdoms collapsed? Because right now you're standing at the gates of the Habsburg Empire. One click, and you walk through them with us. But if you're still watching and somehow still not subscribed, go ahead. Scroll to the comments. Tell us why. Tell us why you'd rather watch history happen than be part of the journey that brings it back to life. To those who've returned, who've stood with us through dynasties and darkness, thank you. You're not just viewers. You're archivists of memory, witnesses of empire. Subscribe, or explain yourself to history. They were nobodies. Mountain knights with rusted swords, forgotten titles, and a crumbling castle that squatted like a wounded animal on the edge of nowhere. But somehow, they dreamed of crowns. It is the year 985. The Carolingian world has collapsed into dust. What Charlemagne once stitched together in iron and scripture has now unraveled into 1,000 fiefdoms, petty wars, and ambitious houses carving their name into bloodied soil. Europe is not a continent. It is a battlefield of egos, oaths, and betrayal. In the shadows of this chaos, far from the glittering courts of Paris or Aachen, lies the Habsburg, the Hawk's Castle, a modest stone fort tucked in the fog of what is now northern Switzerland. This is not the home of kings. It is the home of scavengers. Its lords, the early Habsburgs, are little more than well-positioned opportunists, counts with barely enough land to feed their knights, clinging to relevance through service to greater powers. But inside those walls, ambition simmered like a fever. A belief was born here quietly, absurdly, that they were meant to rule all of Christendom. By the early 13th century, the Holy Roman Empire is a sick giant. Its emperor, Frederick II, is excommunicated, endlessly at war with the papacy and German princes alike. Power splinters into dukedoms and city-states, each proclaiming their autonomy while fearing their neighbors. This is a jungle of swords and parchment, and it is here, precisely here, that a certain Count Rudolf von Habsburg begins his rise. Rudolf is not a man history expected. He has no crown, no royal bloodline, and no fixed destiny. But what he has is far more dangerous in fractured times: political instinct. He courts bishops while commanding soldiers. He marries well Judith of Hohenberg, and he crushes bandits while protecting merchant roads. He serves the collapsing empire faithfully, while quietly preparing to take it for himself. In 1273, with the imperial throne vacant for over 2 decades, Europe faces a dilemma. The great houses Bohemia, Wittelsbach, Luxembourg are locked in bitter gridlock. None can agree on a candidate. The papacy, desperate to prevent the rise of another Frederick, seeks someone pliable, provincial, and unlikely to cause trouble. Rudolf von Habsburg, with no strong enemies and no real base of power, seems perfect. A compromise. A pawn. They couldn't have been more wrong. Rudolph's election as King of the Romans is met with stunned disbelief across Europe. The Luxembourgs sneer. Ottokar II of Bohemia refuses to acknowledge him. But Rudolph wastes no time in proving that he is no placeholder. He immediately demands that Ottokar return the imperial lands he seized during the interregnum, including Austria, Styria, and Carinthia. When Ottokar refuses, Rudolph gathers his allies, sharpens his swords, and marches. At the battle on the Marchfeld in 1278, Rudolph's forces supported by the Hungarian king defeat and kill Ottokar, who had once laughed at the notion of a mountain knight on a throne. The victory gives Rudolph control over Austria, planting the Habsburgs not just in imperial politics, but into the very heart of Central Europe. This is the true beginning not of a kingdom, but of a dynasty that would one day reshape the world map. But even now, as Rudolph ascends, the vultures circle. The Wittelsbachs plot in Bavaria. The Luxembourgs build alliances in the Rhineland. The Bohemians nurse their wounds and whisper vengeance. No one accepts this shepherd of backwaters as a legitimate emperor. And perhaps Rudolph himself feels it too. At his coronation in Aachen, the imperial crown is lowered onto his brow with trembling hands. There is no roaring applause. Only the echo of chanting monks, and the cold silence of Europe watching from behind closed doors. He closes his eyes. This was only the first ghost to sit on a throne they were never meant to hold. They didn't conquer France, they married it. This was the moment the Habsburgs became continental. How many empires can say they married their way into history's most powerful throne? It was not a love letter. It was a contract, written in Latin, bound by blood, and it would change the fate of Europe for centuries. The year is 1477. The chill of winter creeps across the Low Countries. In the heart of Burgundy, the once mighty Duke Charles the Bold lies dead on a frozen battlefield outside Nancy. His only heir, Mary, just 19 years old, finds herself encircled by enemies. France to the west, internal rebellion to the east, and her own nobles watching her like hawks. A duchess in title, but in truth, a prize. A pawn. She must choose her next move carefully. Not a husband, no, something far greater. A shield. A political anchor. Her hand in marriage is now the most valuable weapon on the continent, and kings will kill for it. But it's not a king she chooses. She chooses a Habsburg. Maximilian of Habsburg is not a man of wealth, or armies, or lands. But what he has is lineage and ambition sharpened by his father, Frederick III, Holy Roman Emperor. The Habsburgs are not yet Europe's rulers, but they see the map differently than others. While other dynasties build with iron, the Habsburgs build with vows. The marriage contract between Maximilian and Mary is signed without ceremony, without poetry. It is cold, precise. It states that should Mary die, the Habsburgs will inherit her entire dominion: Flanders, Artois, Brabant, Holland, Zeeland, Luxembourg. This isn't just a union. It's annexation by matrimony. And in that moment the strategy is born: let others wage war. You happy Austria, Mary? Through this single union, the Habsburgs now own the richest commercial centers in Europe, from the Flemish cloth cities to the bustling ports of Bruges and Antwerp. It is the beginning of something massive, and something dangerous. But this brilliance came at a human cost. Mary's marriage alienates many of her subjects. Rebellions rise in Ghent and Bruges. The French king Louis XI had wanted Mary for his own son. Now he's furious and plotting revenge. Meanwhile, Mary finds herself trapped. A queen consort with no real power, caught between her husband's political maneuvering and her people's discontent. In these rooms, diplomacy is not elegant, it is terrifying. Little girls are sent away at 11 to be married at 13. Treaties are signed in blood, annulled with poison. Mothers weep silently behind stone walls as daughters are auctioned off to secure naval passages or trade routes. And as these dynastic unions multiply, Europe itself is reshaped one cradle at a time. The Habsburgs will soon hold not only Burgundy but Castile, Aragon, Naples, and the Holy Roman Empire. The map bleeds Habsburg red. But behind every triumph is a grave. On March 27, 1482, Mary of Burgundy falls from her horse during a hunt. She is pregnant. The saddle snaps. Her body breaks. Within hours, the Duchess who gave the Habsburgs Europe's heartland is dead. Her son, Philip, an infant barely 4 years old, becomes the inheritor of her crown. The empire has begun. And its architect is not old enough to speak. The Duchess was gone. The crown too heavy for a child's head. But the contract remained. A single signature, one woman's dowry, had opened the floodgates. By the time Philip the Handsome could walk, he was already Lord of the Netherlands, heir to the wealthiest territories in Western Europe. But it wasn't until 1496, when he married Joanna of Castile, daughter of Spain's Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, that the Habsburg game of empire truly began to unfold. This was not merely another marriage. This was a political earthquake. Because Joanna was not just a princess, she was a wild card in a dynasty bursting with death. Her older siblings, heirs to Spain's twin kingdoms, began dying one by one. Smallpox, stillbirths, fevers that carried heirs to their graves within days. By 1506, Philip's wife was suddenly heir to both Castile and Aragon, to Spain itself. The boy born of a marriage treaty in Ghent was now, impossibly, on the cusp of ruling from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. But fate does not reward ambition without blood. When Philip suddenly died at just 28, some whispered poison. Others whispered worse. His wife, Joanna, broke down at the coffin, refusing to leave his side. She clutched his cold hand, refused to bury him. And so she wandered Spain with his body silent, weeping, and soon known as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. The madness, real or manufactured, became a mechanism, a tool. Her father Ferdinand took control. And then her son, Charles, was summoned from Flanders to inherit what neither of them could hold: Spain, Burgundy, the Netherlands, and soon, the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. All through 2 marriages. No war. No sieges. Just signatures and funerals. What the world saw as accidents, the death of siblings, the madness of queens, the child kings, were, in Habsburg eyes, providence. The chessboard had shifted, not with cannon fire, but through the cold ink of dynastic calculation. Burgundy brought them wealth. The Netherlands, trade and ports. Spain, gold, armies, and the New World. Charles of Ghent, grandson of Maximilian and Mary, now inherited the greatest concentration of power in Western Europe, without ever raising a blade. And yet he had no idea how much it would cost him. We tend to think of empires as born in war, of lands taken, cities burned, banners raised on bloodied towers. But what if power was not seized, but inherited? What if the most effective conquest was not done by sword but by womb? That was the genius of the Habsburgs. They discovered how to weaponize inheritance itself. While others spilled blood, they swapped rings. While kings rode to battle, Habsburg emissaries rode to wedding feasts. This was the seduction of dynastic peace, not peace from diplomacy, but peace by contract. But it came at a cost far greater than war. What the Habsburgs created was a machine. One fueled not by generals but genealogists. Every union was a ledger entry, a treaty in disguise. With each generation they added new provinces to their dominion, not by conquest, but by clause. Charles V, the grandson of this quiet revolution, did not win his empire. He inherited it. Spain from his mother, Burgundy and the Low Countries from his father, Austria from his grandfather Maximilian. The Holy Roman Empire from an election his family orchestrated through favors and influence. When Charles was crowned emperor in 1519, he didn't stand on a battlefield. He stood on a family tree. But this chain of strategic marriages was not peace at all. It was a delicate balancing act disguised as destiny. Because every inheritance brought not just lands, but obligations, multiple courts, clashing languages, religious fault lines, rival nobility, ancient local laws. The empire he received was not unified, it was stitched together like a beautiful but brittle mosaic, ready to shatter the moment anyone leaned too hard on it. Charles could speak 5 languages, and none fluently enough to silence rebellion. He inherited the Spanish crown, but with it, the rising discontent of Castilian nobles and the pressure of governing the New World. He inherited the Holy Roman Empire, but with it, a growing Protestant movement that would soon ignite into theological civil war. He inherited Burgundy, but its wealthy towns resented distant imperial control. Every crown was a gift wrapped around a dagger. This was the paradox. The very system that gave the Habsburgs peace, made ruling impossible. It wasn't peace at all. It was postponed war. And then there was the human cost. The toll on the bodies of children promised before they could speak. Brides sent across the Alps to foreign courts where they would die young, unknown and unremembered. The tragedy of Joanna of Castile, driven to madness after the death of her husband, her grief weaponized as justification to lock her away. This is the part of Habsburg strategy often forgotten. For every territory gained through marriage, there were women discarded like coins, children raised for bargaining, and young men burdened with crowns they never asked for. Peace may have been inherited, but so was trauma. So the question must be asked, was this strategy brilliant or brutal? Was it genius diplomacy or emotional violence in velvet gloves? And if peace can be inherited, who really pays the price? What Charles inherits is not just an empire, but a responsibility so massive it bends time itself. The dream of a unified Christendom, held together not by war but by shared, and the empire of peace, was already beginning to crack. When your empire is too vast to control by sword, you must rule by symbol. And when your bloodlines bind strangers instead of brothers, you turn to something else entirely, the performance of unity. This was the age of Renaissance humanism, a rebirth of old Roman ideals wrapped in Christian silk. But for the Habsburgs, humanism was never just a philosophy, it was a political tool. While the seams of their empire strained under linguistic, ethnic, and religious division, they turned to spectacle, etiquette, and learning to hold it together. If they couldn't make every subject loyal, they could at least make them impressed. At the Habsburg courts from Ghent to Innsbruck to Vienna, a new kind of power was emerging, the soft power of ritual, language, and beauty. Humanist scholars like Juan Luis Vives and Erasmus of Rotterdam wrote letters and treatises at the edges of imperial power, their work copied and gifted across borders. Tutors taught Latin, rhetoric, and ancient Greek to young princes, not to prepare them for war but for negotiation. The Habsburgs understood something their rivals didn't. Violence alienates, but language persuades. Culture seduces. The court itself became a theater of legitimacy. Every bow, every wine goblet, every embroidered sleeve was part of a choreography designed to send one message: we are civilized. We are ordained. We are necessary. Diplomacy was not born on a battlefield, it was born at a dinner table. And no family in Europe was better at dressing politics as poetry than the Habsburgs. Their court became a diplomatic crucible, where enemies dined together, smiled in paintings, and signed treaties they didn't understand because no one dared break etiquette. A glance could signal insult. A seating chart could start a war. But in this game the Habsburgs were masters. Letters replaced swords. Marriages replaced invasions. Embassies flourished permanent ones for the first time. The idea of statecraft as continuous, polite conversation emerged right here, in the velvet halls of Habsburg diplomacy. Kings no longer needed to fight each other, they could duel through envoys, debates, and dinner. But beneath this grace was a darker necessity. The empire was so fragmented, so unstable that it couldn't survive on force. It had to mesmerize. It had to perform strength even when weak. That's what humanism offered. The illusion of timeless order, of imperial destiny dressed in classical garb. At its peak, the Habsburg court culture created an identity not just for the monarchy but for the entire empire. Painters like Titian and Rubens immortalized Habsburg rulers as Roman emperors. Historians rewrote lineage to connect them to Julius Caesar. Poets sang of harmony while religious violence brewed just beyond the palace walls. This wasn't just a mask. It was a fortress. But culture can only stretch so far. A painting cannot unify a peasant revolt. A Latin speech cannot silence a German sermon. He ruled the old world and the new but couldn't save his soul. On October 23, 1520, in the Grand Cathedral of Aachen, a young man kneels before the imperial crown. He is 20 years old. His eyes are quiet. His shoulders already slumped. This is Charles V, the grandson of dynasties, a prince of continents, a titan born not by conquest but by contract. From his mother, Joanna of Castile, he inherits Spain, Naples, and the New World. From his father, Philip the Handsome, he takes the Netherlands and Burgundy. From his grandfather, Maximilian I, he receives Austria and now the imperial title, Holy Roman Emperor. This is what the Habsburgs have built for over a century. A vast, stitched-together empire held not by a sword, but by a bloodline. The map is staggering. From the silver mines of Peru to the alpine peaks of Tyrol, from Flemish merchant towns to Sicilian vineyards, Charles rules the sunlit and the shadowed. But behind that glittering facade is a storm he cannot escape. The 16th century is not made for peace. It is made for rupture. Across Germany, a monk named Martin Luther nails 95 theses to a church door and ignites a wildfire. Across the Mediterranean, Suleiman the Magnificent rides westward with 100,000 soldiers, determined to breach Vienna's gates. Across the Atlantic, Spanish ships begin pulling entire civilizations into chains. Charles is not merely a king. He is a living dam holding back a world gone mad. He attempts to govern it all personally, relentlessly. He speaks 5 languages, travels constantly, wears armor under his robes, dictates letters at night with his feet in ice water to stay awake. But each kingdom he rules speaks its own tongue, worships its own god, fights its own war. What he inherited was not one empire, it was 1,000 demands bound together by his last name. The dream of Christendom united under one crown, the vision that drove the Habsburg strategy for generations, now rests entirely on Charles. And it is killing him. His brother Ferdinand begs for autonomy in Austria. His Spanish subjects revolt against foreign-born ministers. His German princes embrace Protestantism not just as faith, but as rebellion. And the Ottomans advance. Charles wins great battles at Tunis, at Pavia, but he loses the peace. The Schmalkaldic League defies him. The printing press mocks him. Even his victories feel hollow. Cities burned, heretics multiplied, friends turned strangers. He tries to do what no one has done since Charlemagne: reunite the West under one throne. But his empire is not held by loyalty. It is held by fear. And fear, like inheritance, decays. By the 1550s, the emperor, once a golden idol of unity, has become a broken man. His body is racked with gout. His armies are stretched thin. His advisors are divided. His faith in divine mission has become a quiet, cruel joke. So Charles makes a decision no one expects. He will resign. Not as a failure of power but as a surrender to its impossibility. In 1556, Charles V removes the crown. He divides his empire in two, Spain and the Americas to his son Philip II, Austria and the Holy Roman Empire to his brother Ferdinand I. And then he walks away. He retires to a remote monastery in Yusti, surrounded by mist, silence, and regrets. There, the most powerful man in Europe begins copying music scores by hand, studying clocks, writing letters no one answers, and reliving every decision he could never take back. This was the price of building an empire through inheritance, that eventually, someone would inherit a burden too great for any mortal man to carry. While Charles V retreats to silence, Europe does not. The moment he lays down the imperial crown, the world he tried to hold together begins to devour itself. This was not one crisis. It was three apocalypses happening all at once. In 1517, an obscure Augustinian friar named Martin Luther nails a list of arguments to the church door in Wittenberg. 95 theses. Modest in tone. Explosive in consequence. Luther doesn't just criticize indulgences, he questions the moral and spiritual monopoly of the church itself. The Reformation is born not in fire, but in footnotes. But within months, it spreads like an inferno. Printing presses churn out his works in German, French, Dutch, and English. Sermons echo from pulpits once loyal to Rome. Priests marry. Altars are stripped. Cathedrals are vandalized. For Charles V, this is not a debate. It is treason in cassocks. At the Diet of Worms in 1521, he demands Luther recant. Luther refuses. Charles declares him an outlaw. But too late, the movement has outgrown the man. Dozens of princes hungry for land and sick of Rome's gold-draining demands join the new faith. And Charles? He is forced to fight his own vassals. At the very same time, on a very different front, the Ottoman Empire moves westward like a rising tide. Led by Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans are not raiders. They are a machine of conquest. In 1526, they crushed the Kingdom of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs. The king drowned, his crown lost in the mud. 2 years later, Ottoman armies lay siege to Vienna, itself the imperial capital of the Habsburgs. For the first time since the fall of Rome, Christian Europe trembles at the edge of annihilation. Charles is not merely fending off religious reformers. He is waging a war for civilization as he understands it, against an empire with better artillery, better logistics, and a sense of divine momentum. He wins some battles. He holds Vienna. But the Ottoman threat never disappears. Instead, it becomes a permanent shadow on the eastern horizon, a reminder that while Charles fights to preserve religious unity, he is surrounded by enemies whose unity is already real. And then comes the third front, rebellion from below. Between 1524 and 1525, over 300,000 peasants rise up across German lands in what becomes the German Peasants' War. They carry copies of the Bible. They demand the right to read it. They demand the abolition of serfdom. They tear down hunting lodges, kill tax collectors, storm castles. Luther condemns them. Charles ignores them until the bloodshed forces his hand. The rebellion is crushed viciously. Tens of thousands are slaughtered. But the damage is done. The myth of divinely ordained hierarchy is shattered. The idea that kings are chosen by God no longer convinces the poor. And in the end, Charles doesn't just fight Protestants. He fights popes who defy him, princes who betray him, soldiers who desert him, subjects who hate him, and a foreign enemy whose banner flies crescent moons instead of crosses. No empire can survive on so many fronts, not even his. Charles begins to realize the truth. his empire is too big for any one man. It isn't an empire. It's a fragile illusion of continuity, kept alive by the paperwork of inheritance and the rituals of court. But beneath that fire. And so, when Charles abdicates, he doesn't hand off a crown. He hands off a powder keg. To Philip II he gives Spain, the Indies, and the weight of colonial wealth and rebellion. To Ferdinand he gives Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and a church in fragments. And to history he leaves a question. Can any man inherit a world without being torn apart by it? He ruled more land than anyone since the Caesars, yet he died alone, in a monastery, haunted by the weight of it all. In 1556, Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, ruler of the New World and Naples, did the unthinkable. He resigned. It was the first voluntary imperial abdication in over 1,000 years. Not forced by revolution. Not deposed in war. Not murdered in palace intrigue. He simply let go. But why? Was it humility? Wisdom? A final act of Christian piety? Or was it defeat, a quiet admission that the Habsburg dream had failed? The ceremony of abdication is breathtaking in its solemnity. Charles, now bloated and crippled by gout, can barely stand. He leans on Philip II's shoulder, his face blank, his voice ragged. Before an assembly of dukes and dignitaries, he delivers a final speech thanking God, apologizing for his faults and asking only for prayers. He does not rage. He does not weep. He surrenders calmly, deliberately, publicly. This was not a retirement. It was a reckoning. Because Charles had come to see what few rulers ever live long enough to realize, that the empire he inherited could never be governed, only endured. He had spent decades trying to unify Christendom under one crown, one church, one identity. But instead, he watched as Protestantism tore Germany apart, as Ottoman cannons thundered at Vienna, and as revolts smoldered across Castile and the Netherlands. He ruled a fractured Europe that no longer believed in unity and perhaps never had. Even the church he defended turned against him. Even his own family, the supposedly indissoluble Habsburg machine, was cracking under the strain. And so Charles made the most radical decision of his reign. He divided the empire. Spain and its vast overseas territories would pass to his son, Philip II, a man raised in the Spanish court, cold, calculating, and deeply Catholic. The Holy Roman Empire would pass to his brother Ferdinand, less devout, more pragmatic, fluent in the languages of the empire's patchwork peoples. It was a partition not of land but of burden. He did not leave an empire behind. He left a problem, two problems, in fact each too large, too unwieldy, and now too separate to ever be whole again. In retirement, Charles V lived not as a king but as a monk. No retinue. No court. No army. He copied music. He studied clocks. He limped through the cloisters at dawn. And always, he wrote. Letters, reflections, notes on sermons and statecraft. He was not seeking redemption. He was performing penance for an empire he could never truly command. And even here in Yusti the world would not leave him alone. Storms flooded his chambers. Plague threatened the nearby villages. Letters arrived from Spain, from Vienna, pleading for his voice, his wisdom, his name. He responded less and less. His body swelled. His mind drifted. And finally, in 1558, Charles died not with a crown on his head, but with a crucifix in his hands. He died surrounded not by courtiers but by silence. No empire ever truly belonged to him. He merely held it for a time, and it broke him. But history has never agreed on how to judge him. Was his abdication a final act of humility? A return to God after the noise of power? Or was it a whispered admission that the Habsburg dream had outgrown even the man it was built for? Maybe it was both. Maybe Charles V didn't step down because he failed. Maybe he stepped down because he finally saw what no emperor before him had dared to see. That no man, no dynasty, no divine bloodline, can hold the world in their hands without crushing themselves. She didn't speak against the church. She didn't write a pamphlet. She only hummed the wrong melody, one the church had forgotten to approve. This was Spain, 1570s. A global empire built on gold, ruled by the most Catholic king and stalked by silence. The Inquisition needed no armies, just ears. And under Philip II the ears were everywhere. The sun never set on Spain, but the shadows it cast stretched far deeper. At its height, Habsburg Spain ruled half the known world. From the Andes to Antwerp, from Manila to Milan. The riches of the Americas, silver from Potosi, gold from Mexico poured into royal treasuries. No king before Philip had ever ruled such vast dominions. But for Philip II, gold was not enough. What he wanted was unity. Not just political but spiritual. Not just loyalty but certainty. He would become the sword of Catholicism, hammering heresy flat not just in Europe but across oceans. He would build a global faith to match his global crown. In the mountains outside Madrid, Philip constructs his answer to the Renaissance, El Escorial. It is not a palace of pleasure. It is a monastery with a throne inside. A granite crucifix rendered in architecture. Here he rules as both king and penitent. His robes are black. His days are rigid. His court whispers in hushed tones. He reads dispatches by candlelight and prays among tombs. This is not the exuberant, sensual Spain of conquistadors and poets. This is Philip's Spain, ascetic, anxious, and devout. Beneath its tiled courtyards, every breath is monitored. Every gesture weighed for signs of sin. And at the heart of it all, Philip's unshakable belief that he has been chosen by God to defend the one true faith. But faith had a price, and it was paid in silence, in suffering, and in coin. The endless wars to uphold Catholicism drained Spain's vaults faster than any conquest could replenish them. While cathedrals rose across Europe, and saints were canonized in Philip's name, his empire was bleeding silver into the dirt. Spanish troops mutinied in Flanders for lack of pay. Starvation crept through rural Castile. They had the gold of empires, but their prayers were for forgiveness. And still Philip believed. He believed when he sent the Inquisition into Protestant Navarre. He believed when he outlawed books in native tongues across the Americas. He believed when he burned converted Muslims who kept whispering the Quran at night. Was it faith? Or fear disguised as faith? Was this the righteous defense of Catholic orthodoxy or colonial panic in robes? In 1588, Philip made his most audacious move. He assembled the Invincible Armada, a fleet of 130 ships to crush Protestant England and restore the Catholic Church under Elizabeth's feet. It was not just a war. It was a crusade. Papal blessings were given. Prayers said. Flags anointed with holy water. But the fleet was poorly supplied. The strategy confused. The winds unforgiving. As the Armada rounded Scotland, God or fate answered with a vengeance. The ships scattered. The men drowned. The empire blinked. The Armada didn't just fail militarily. It failed spiritually. The world had watched the most Catholic king attempt to impose salvation by storm, and the heavens had torn it from his grasp. Philip did not live to see the final unraveling of Spain's power. But the cracks had already formed. Economic collapse, uprisings in the Netherlands, and a creeping realization that the faith he imposed so forcefully was hollow at its core. Spain had conquered lands, souls, and oceans, but it had lost its flexibility. And empires, like bones, break when they cannot bend. Philip II built a Catholic fortress across the world. But no fortress lasts forever, not when it is built on silence, guilt, and debt. And so, as the last masts of the Armada sank beneath the gray Atlantic, it wasn't just a fleet that drowned. It was the first sign that the Habsburg dream was too heavy to float. The sun never set on Philip's empire. But it didn't rise in unison either. When you hold the world in your hands, it doesn't whisper in one voice and it screams in dozens. That was the curse of the Habsburg world system. Vast, glittering, and terrifyingly unmanageable. In theory, Philip II ruled everything. In reality, he was a man surrounded by maps and drowning in paper. Every day, ships arrived from the Americas, from Flanders, from the Philippines. They brought reports of rebellions, famines, tax shortfalls, outbreaks of disease, resistance to conversion, ships lost at sea. And all of it awaited the king's personal attention. Philip refused to delegate. He read every letter, approved every edict. He ruled as though every corner of his empire were within reach of his ink. But the world is not ruled from behind a desk. And soon the desk becomes a trap. He believed the empire was his burden, but it was becoming his coffin. By the end of his reign, Philip II had become a prisoner of his own obsession with control. He rarely left the Escorial. His health declined. His letters became shorter, his handwriting shakier. He grew afraid of mirrors, of light, of interruption. His empire had become a labyrinth of details, and he its exhausted minotaur. But the problem wasn't just scale. It was contradiction. The Habsburg Empire was built on two competing engines: extraction and salvation. On one hand, it depended on silver, labor, and conquest. On the other, it promised Catholic harmony, obedience, and divine grace. But what happens when you force native Andean peoples to convert, only to work them to death in silver mines? What happens when your soldiers enforce piety in the Netherlands by burning rebels alive, then go unpaid for months? You get an empire with too many faces, too many wounds, and too many lies. You get a world held together by brute faith and nothing else. Spain's global holdings had grown too fast. The crown was deep in debt to German and Genoese bankers. Inflation from New World silver had hollowed out the domestic economy. Bread prices tripled. The treasury defaulted multiple times in Philip's reign alone. And yet, the wars continued. In the east, the Ottomans had to be checked. In the north, the Dutch had to be crushed. In the sea, English pirates had to be punished. In the colonies, souls had to be saved. Everywhere, control had to be maintained even if it cost the empire itself. There is a moment in every empire's life where it forgets what it's for. Philip's Spain reached that moment in the final decades of the 16th century. It had become an empire not of ambition, but of inertia. A machine that could no longer stop moving even as its wheels cracked beneath it. What had started as a divine mission had become a logistical nightmare. Faith became bureaucracy. Majesty became ritual. Wealth became debt. And power became paralysis. Philip died in 1598 alone, ill, clinging to his crucifix. His empire passed to his son, but the cracks remained. The burden was no longer spiritual, it was structural. An empire too big to fail, but too slow to change. The burden of world empire wasn't just physical. It was metaphysical. It asked, can any one crown represent the will of God, the laws of man, the commerce of the globe, and the salvation of every soul, at the same time? Spain tried. And now the strain was beginning to show. They painted angels on the ceilings, and burned the accused in the cellars. This was the Habsburg paradox. A kingdom of saints and informants. A palace of light built over dungeons. The Spanish Inquisition, officially founded in 1478, reached its zenith under Philip II, becoming both the moral spine and the psychological shadow of his empire. Its mission was simple: to preserve Catholic orthodoxy. But the methods were anything but. The machinery of fear was subtle. It began with a whisper, a neighbor's suspicion, a priest's uneasy glance, an anonymous letter. Then came the arrest, the disappearance, the long silence. Detainees weren't told their charges. Trials were held in secret. Evidence was often hearsay. Torture was permitted. And heresy? It didn't require books or rebellion. It could be as simple as using the wrong words at Massachusetts, or failing to light a candle on the right day, or, in the case of thousands of Morisco's Muslims forcibly converted to Christianity speaking Arabic behind closed doors. It wasn't just religion. It was cultural erasure, systematic, relentless, and wrapped in the language of salvation. And yet, at the very moment Spain was silencing its soul, it also unleashed its artistic golden age. Painters like El Greco with his haunting, elongated saints, Velázquez with his royal intimacy and psychological depth, and Murillo with his glowing Madonnas, were flourishing in the very same empire where books were banned, and ideas had to pass censors like heretics passed inquisitors. Cathedrals rose like mountains. Baroque architecture exploded in gold leaf and theological allegory. Literature reached new heights. Cervantes' Don Quixote emerged not from freedom, but from the edge of censorship. Even the arts became a form of containment, channels through which spiritual anxiety could be channeled into divine beauty. Where suspicion was law, beauty became its alibi. The grandeur of Spanish Habsburg culture was not accidental. It was intentional. The church and the crown understood the psychological power of beauty. Art was used not to liberate but to indoctrinate, to awe, to domesticate rebellion. Every cathedral fresco, every altarpiece, every sacred mass was designed to remind the viewer of order, that God had chosen a structure, a hierarchy, the truth, and to question it even silently was to risk everything. The Inquisition didn't just burn books. It made art dangerous. It turned aesthetics into obedience. But sometimes, the cracks showed. El Greco's saints looked too otherworldly. Velázquez's kings looked too human. Cervantes's madman looked too much like everyone else. Even in silence, the soul resisted. How do you define greatness in an age of cruelty? The Spain of Philip II gave the world some of its most profound spiritual art. But it did so while policing the soul. It created a sacred visual language while mutilating bodies in secret. This was the Habsburg inheritance, a world where beauty and terror lived side by side, where angels hovered over scaffolds, where poetry flourished beneath gallows, where the divine was used not to uplift but to control. As the 17th century dawned, the gold kept arriving from the New World. The cathedrals grew more ornate, but the air inside them grew colder, because the empire that once burned with religious fervor was now ruled by fear. And fear, like fire, eventually consumes its own altar. The empire looked eternal, but its silence was beginning to tremble. Empires rarely die in battle. They bleed out quietly, invisibly until there's nothing left but ceremony and silence. By the end of the 16th century, Habsburg Spain was still the largest empire on earth. Its map glittered. Its banners flew from the Andes to Antwerp. But behind the facade, it was already dying. And no one wanted to admit it. The gold and silver that once flowed from the Americas now poisoned the very veins of Spain. Instead of investing in infrastructure, agriculture, or industrial growth, the crown became addicted to foreign credit, borrowing against future treasure shipments that might never arrive. When silver did come, it brought inflation, not prosperity. Prices soared. Wages stagnated. Spanish wool, once Europe's finest, was undersold by northern merchants. Meanwhile, the rising merchant classes in the Netherlands and England, not bound by the dead weight of empire, began to outcompete their Spanish overlords. The empire had global reach but no pulse at home. Madrid grew pompous and hollow. Rural Spain emptied as men left for colonial wars or were conscripted to maintain distant holdings. Farmlands were abandoned. Famine became cyclical. And yet the court still hosted gilded banquets, quoting Latin maxims about divine rule as the people outside begged for bread. After Philip II's death, his successors Philip III, Philip IV, and finally Charles II inherited the throne not as monarchs of momentum, but as managers of decline. Philip III was devout, but distant, preferring religious retreats to statecraft. He expelled the Moriscos, descendants of converted Muslims, removing hundreds of thousands of skilled artisans and farmers from the economy, all in the name of purity. Philip IV preferred art to administration, commissioning Velázquez's masterpieces while bankrupting the treasury again in a failed war with France. Each reign the decisions became smaller. The problems became larger. The ambitions shrank. But perhaps no event better symbolized Spain's bleeding than the loss of the Netherlands, a region that had once been the crown jewel of Habsburg wealth. After decades of war, rebellion, and repression, the Spanish were forced to recognize Dutch independence in 1648. It was more than a political failure. It was a humiliation. A public acknowledgement that Spain could no longer hold what it had conquered. That time and resistance had outlasted power. The Treaty of Westphalia didn't just end a war. It marked the moment when Spain ceded its spiritual monopoly. Europe would now be a continent of divided faiths, divided powers, and Spain, once the fist of God, now found itself an old man at a young man's table. By the time Charles II ascends to the throne in 1665, Spain is a ghost of its former self. Charles is the physical embodiment of centuries of inbreeding, his Habsburg jaw so pronounced he can barely speak or chew. He suffers seizures, cannot produce an heir, and is ruled by factions who feud while the state starves. Superstition surrounds him. Priests perform exorcisms at court. He is the final Habsburg king of Spain. And he never ruled, only lingered. Spain bled out not because it was weak, but because it refused to adapt. Its faith became rigidity. Its wealth became rot. Its kings became shadows. The Inquisition still burned. The paintings still glowed. The cathedrals still stood. But the heart had stopped beating. The fate of Europe once turned on a hill outside Vienna, where a Habsburg gamble held back centuries of conquest. It is September 1683. The armies of the Ottoman Empire, nearly 150,000 strong, stand at the gates of Vienna, the golden capital of Habsburg power. For 2 months they have bombarded its walls. Tunnels have been dug beneath its bastions. Thousands of citizens huddle in churches. Grain runs low. Fear runs high. And inside the imperial court, behind its Baroque walls and marble halls, the empire is not prepared, not spiritually, not militarily, and certainly not emotionally for what's coming. This is not just a war. This is a reckoning between Islam and Christendom, between East and West, between centuries of ambition and decades of neglect. At its center is Emperor Leopold I, a man of rigid faith and softer nerve. He is not a general. He is not a reformer. He is a scholar emperor, obsessed with court ritual, celestial alignments, and divine providence. When the Ottomans approach, Leopold doesn't ride to battle, he flees the city with his court, leaving behind a garrison of starving farmers, mercenaries, and monks to defend Vienna's soul. But here lies the paradox. The empire that presents itself as the last line of Catholic defense, the sword of God against the crescent moon, has lost the unity that made that claim believable. Vienna was beautiful, but it was a stage set. While the court dazzled with concerts and Latin orations, the empire fractured. Peasants whispered of tax corruption. Protestant minorities, still raw from Counter-Reformation purges, viewed the war not as salvation but as someone else's cause. Inside the capital, Baroque grandeur masked panic. Outside the walls, Turkish sappers worked in silence. The Habsburgs had long styled themselves as defenders of the faith, inheritors of Charles V's dream of a unified Christendom. But now the faith was brittle and the empire it upheld was a patchwork of coerced obedience, not common belief. And yet the walls held. On September 12, 1683, a relief force of Polish, Austrian and German troops led by King Jan Sobieski of Poland descended upon the Ottoman lines. It was the largest cavalry charge in European history. Over 20,000 winged hussars, sabers raised, thundered down from the Kahlenberg heights. It was not a Habsburg victory. It was a coalition survival, a moment borrowed from fate, not secured by planning. The Ottomans retreated. Vienna was saved. Europe exhaled. And yet, something had shifted. The Ottomans retreated. But so did the illusion. In the years that followed, the empire grew territorially. Hungary was reclaimed. The Habsburgs pushed into the Balkans. Baroque monuments multiplied. But spiritually the cracks widened. Why? Because the victory at Vienna masked a deeper truth, that loyalty had been purchased, not inherited. That faith had been enforced, not embraced. Protestant communities across the empire seethed in silence. Tax revolts flared. Intellectuals began to question divine monarchy. And in the salons of Vienna itself, whispers of new ideas, reason, liberty, science began to circulate. The Habsburgs may have defended Vienna with Catholic swords, but their children would soon read secular books. This was the real aftermath of 1683. The empire had survived the siege. But in surviving, it revealed its contradictions, its reliance on borrowed armies, its dependence on borrowed faith, and its distance from the people it claimed to protect. And from that moment on, the Habsburgs were no longer just rulers. They were symbols, grand, immovable, and increasingly out of time. The Ottomans had failed to breach Vienna. But behind the gates, the fire was already smoldering. They called it the defenestration of Prague. 2 royal envoys flung out of a window into history. It was not the first window broken in Europe's religious struggle, but it would shatter more than glass. The year is 1618. The peace between Catholic and Protestant powers, uneasy since the days of Charles V, has finally collapsed. Bohemia revolts. The Protestant estates, fearing forced conversion and imperial retribution, rise against Habsburg rule. What began as a regional uprising quickly spirals into a continental catastrophe. This is not a war. This is a reckoning. For 30 years, Europe is torn apart in the name of faith. But beneath the banners of Christ, Catholic and Protestant alike, lies a struggle for power. The Habsburgs, led by Ferdinand II, are determined to reclaim the spiritual unity of the empire. For them, this war is a crusade, a divine mission to restore the Catholic heart of Europe. They invoke the Virgin, the saints, the legacy of Charles V. They raise armies from Austria and Spain. They promise salvation through fire and steel. But their enemies Denmark, Sweden, France, and dozens of Protestant princes see something else. A chance to break the spine of Habsburg dominance. Magdeburg, a Protestant stronghold. 30,000 civilians massacred in a single day by Catholic troops. Not for strategy. Not for victory. For vengeance. This is the war's true face. The 30 Years' War becomes the most destructive conflict in European history until the 20th century. It's not just soldiers who die, it's farmers, children, entire villages. Famine follows armies. Plague spreads like sermons. The land itself seems cursed. By the mid-1630s, the Holy Roman Empire is a graveyard of its own ambition. And still the war continues. The Habsburgs, clinging to legitimacy, double down. But with every passing year they spend more blood, silver, trust. Their Spanish cousins sink into their own morass. The Ottomans loom again at the eastern edge. And in the north, Swedish and French armies push deeper into imperial territory, not to defend Protestantism but to reshape the political order itself. The war becomes a contradiction. A religious war fought by mercenaries, a crusade led by atheists, a defense of order that destroys order itself. And yet, out of this fire something new is born. In 1648, after 3 decades of chaos, the warring powers gather to negotiate what none could achieve on the battlefield: peace. The Peace of Westphalia redraws Europe not with swords but with clauses. It recognizes the sovereignty of over 300 German states, effectively shattering the Holy Roman Empire into fragments. It legalizes Lutheranism and Calvinism alongside Catholicism. It marks the beginning of modern diplomacy and the end of any hope for religious unity. The Habsburgs have lost something far greater than territory. They have lost the very idea that once held the empire together. The dream of a unified Christendom kept alive since Charlemagne, revived by Charles V, defended by Vienna, was now dead. In its place stood something colder, more pragmatic, more modern. A Europe no longer ruled by divine certainties, but by sovereign states, by negotiation not scripture, by interest not inheritance. The Habsburgs survived but changed. They could no longer claim to speak for all of Christendom. They could no longer command obedience with sacraments alone. To remain relevant they would have to adapt. The 30 Years' War had shown them the limits of force. And now, as the Enlightenment rose, a new world began to form, one where emperors would be asked not what they inherited, but what they knew. The war ended in 1648. But its aftershocks would echo through every palace corridor, every church, and every revolution for centuries to come. The last time Europe stood this close to the edge, it didn't know it. But in 1683 it did. The Ottoman Empire, the most enduring power east of the Danube, has returned to Vienna, not as traders or diplomats, as conquerors. And this time they've come to finish what they started over a century before. The Siege of Vienna is not just a campaign. It is the collision of 2 civilizations and the last breath of an old world. Leading this immense force is Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man of ambition, discipline, and dreams of imperial glory. He brings with him over 150,000 soldiers. Janissaries, engineers, cavalry, and artillery specialists. Their objective is simple: take Vienna, breach Christendom, and open the road to Rome. Opposing them is a fractured empire. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, already tested by religious wars and internal dissent, abandons the city at the first sign of invasion. He leaves behind a garrison of 11,000 men, hastily fortified ramparts, and a terrified population. Among the defenders are foreign mercenaries, priests with muskets, and ordinary Viennese, conscripted to dig trenches and douse fuses. Vienna, symbol of Habsburg power and Catholic endurance, is left to stand or fall on its own. Day by day the walls are worn down. The Ottomans dig tunnels. Mines explode beneath bastions. The air reeks of gunpowder and spoiled grain. Every morning Viennese citizens wake wondering if they'll live to see nightfall. But the real siege isn't just physical. It's spiritual. The memory of Constantinople's fall in 1453 haunts every cathedral. The fear that Europe itself will be broken, just as the Holy Roman Empire had been shattered by war and heresy, becomes unbearable. And yet, even as the Habsburg court prays in distant monasteries, help is forming. In one of the most remarkable alliances in early modern history, help comes from the north. Poland's King Jan III Sobieski, devout Catholic and seasoned commander, answers the call. He assembles an army of Poles, Austrians and German states. Their goal: liberate Vienna and stop the Ottoman advance once and for all. They march under banners of the Virgin Mary. But their arrival is not guaranteed. They must cross difficult terrain. They are outnumbered, and time is running out. Inside Vienna, the defenders are down to their last supplies. Morale is vanishing. Disease spreads. The Ottomans prepare the final assault. Then on September 12, 1683, just before dawn, the hills above the city shimmer with armor. Relief has come. What happens next is legend. At 4 a.m., the combined Christian forces descend the hills in a coordinated assault, infantry pressing the flanks, cavalry circling, artillery roaring. The Ottoman lines, drawn thin by 2 months of siege, begin to bend. And then, at the critical hour, comes the largest cavalry charge in European history. Over 20,000 mounted troops, led by the Polish winged hussars, crash into the enemy's flank. Their feathered backs scream through the wind. Their sabers gleam. Their hooves thunder. It is not just an attack, it is a release of centuries of fear, humiliation, and divine hope. The Ottomans break. Kara Mustafa retreats in disarray. The siege is lifted. Vienna is saved. The Battle of Vienna was hailed as a miracle, a divine sign, a turning point in history. For the Habsburgs it was a rebirth. Leopold I emerged as a savior. The empire expanded into Hungary. The Catholic world rejoiced. And for the first time in generations, the dynasty that had nearly been destroyed by internal revolt stood again as the defenders of Christendom. But not all victories are clear. The city was in ruins. Thousands lay dead. The empire was still fractured. And underneath the hymns of thanksgiving, a new rhythm had begun to pulse through the empire, a rhythm not of crusade, but of curiosity. Vienna had been saved by faith, but it would be reshaped by reason. Because while the Ottomans fled, new winds were rising in Europe, winds of enlightenment, skepticism, and reform. The Habsburgs had defended the gates. But inside the gates, something far more radical was now preparing to awaken. Vienna was saved, but salvation brought questions. In the afterglow of victory, Emperor Leopold I marched in triumph through the streets of his capital, crowned again in the eyes of Rome as the defender of Catholic Europe. But beyond the perfumed halls of Vienna, the empire he ruled was anything but Catholic in spirit. From the marshes of Croatia to the hills of Bohemia, from Transylvanian villages to Hungarian plains, the Habsburgs presided over a mosaic of beliefs. Lutherans, Calvinists, Orthodox Christians, Jews, Muslims, Unitarians, many of them weary of bloodshed, but unwilling to kneel before a single creed. And so the empire faced a choice: embrace pluralism or crush it. Leopold chose control. Though Westphalia had legalized Protestant worship, Leopold moved swiftly to reassert Catholic dominance. Edicts were issued. Evangelical churches were shuttered. Protestant schools were dismantled. Mixed-faith marriages were prohibited unless the children would be raised Catholic. Those who refused to convert were stripped of titles, lands, or exiled entirely. It was not merely theological. It was imperial discipline, a belief that loyalty to the dynasty required submission to its God. To question the church was to question the crown. To tolerate heresy was to invite disorder. But in trying to stamp out spiritual dissonance, the Habsburgs lit new fires. The empire had inherited a population of survivors, people who had endured Ottoman occupation, war, and famine. Now, under Habsburg liberation, they found their local customs ignored, their religions criminalized, and their voices silenced. In Hungary, Transylvania, and parts of the Balkans, rebellion flared. Turek uprisings, coalitions of Calvinist nobles, Orthodox villagers, and disaffected Catholics raged across the countryside. They weren't just political, They were existential. For many, resisting the Habsburgs was not rebellion, it was a return to freedom. These were not isolated revolts. They were warnings. And they would echo for generations. Even as Enlightenment ideas seeped through Vienna's salons, the Habsburg court clung to a vision of imperial Catholic orthodoxy: one altar, one emperor, one God. But the world was changing. The rise of natural law, tolerance literature, and early secular governance in France, England, and Prussia exposed the Habsburg contradiction. The empire claimed to be both universal and particular Catholic in identity, but multinational in reality. This duality strained every law, every edict, every diplomatic gesture. Could a Calvinist trust a Catholic crown? Could a Jew own land in Galicia? Could a Greek Orthodox family in Transylvania raise their children in peace? The answers more often than not were no. What if unity itself was the illusion? The empire was held together not by shared belief but by inertia, fear, and bureaucracy. And yet, within its very borders, the seeds of religious coexistence began to take root quietly, defiantly, in local agreements, unspoken tolerances, and whispered prayers. Habsburg authority depended on ritual and dogma. But the people, exhausted by war, wanted space to breathe. They wanted fields, not banners. They wanted sermons, not excommunication. And slowly that desire would become demand. As the 18th century dawns, a new generation of Habsburg rulers, educated, conflicted, ambitious, will inherit this question. They will no longer face Ottomans or heretics on battlefields. They will face ideas. And in the salons of Vienna, a revolution of thought begins to stir, one that will shake the empire far more than gunpowder ever could. Religious pluralism had been a weakness the Habsburgs tried to suppress. But it was fast becoming the only future they had left. If this story is pulling you deeper, if the rise of this forgotten family from a crumbling fortress to an empire speaks to something eternal, don't forget to subscribe. We're only just opening the vault. Ahead lies betrayal, bloodlines, and the unraveling of power that once seemed divine. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next, because empires may fall, but their ghosts always return. She ruled with instinct. He ruled with ideas. Together they broke the very thing they tried to fix. She birthed 16 children. And an empire. Maria Theresa of Austria, a queen without a crown in a world ruled by men, entered history in labor, body trembling, while ambassadors haggled over her dynasty's future in the next room. She did not ask for power. She inherited it and then rewrote the rules of how it was worn. Her father, Charles VI, had tried to guarantee her inheritance with the pragmatic sanction, a desperate gamble to allow a woman to rule the Habsburg realms. But when he died, the powers of Europe, Prussia, France, Bavaria, ignored it. They saw a young mother, a fragile queen, a broken dynasty. What they got was a steel spine and silk gloves. Maria Theresa did not retreat. She fought and she ruled. While nursing infants, she restructured armies. While grieving her father, she waged wars. She outmaneuvered Frederick the Great, faced down French intrigue, and held together a realm that had laughed at the idea of a woman on the throne. But Maria Theresa was not just a monarch. She was a mother to a dynasty and to an idea. She believed the Habsburg Empire could evolve. That through education, discipline, and Catholic virtue, she could modernize without surrendering control. Yet even as she fortified the empire's outer walls, she planted an ideological powder keg inside it. That boy, quiet, observant, shadowed by brilliance, was Joseph, her son, her successor, her contradiction. Joseph too did not rule with instinct. He ruled with ideas. Born into power, but haunted by philosophy, he came of age reading the Enlightenment's sacred texts that questioned divine rule, mocked tradition, and demanded liberty over lineage. Where his mother had governed with careful reform and Catholic moralism, Joseph would rule with radical logic. Joseph abolished serfdom. He passed edicts of toleration, granting Protestants and Jews civil rights. He tried to centralize the empire under German. He limited the power of the Catholic Church, closing monasteries he deemed useless. He was, in many ways, centuries ahead of his time. But in an empire stitched together by ritual, hierarchy, and faith, these ideas burned the thread. Maria Theresa, aged, powerful, revered, watched her son dismantle the world she had preserved. He admired Voltaire. She prayed to the Virgin. He trusted law. She trusted tradition. Though she never publicly disavowed him, she wept behind palace walls. Their letters, once warm, turned cold, then sparse, then silent. They ruled together but never in harmony. 2 heads. 1 crown. And the empire began to split along the fault line between them. Joseph outlived his mother by just 9 years. He died alone, aged only 48. Unmarried. Unloved. His tombstone reads in Latin, "Here lies Joseph, who failed in all he undertook." But that wasn't entirely true. He modernized law, advanced civil rights, and made power answerable to logic, if only for a moment. What he failed at was holding together the contradictions that defined the Habsburg world. Divine right and rational rule. Absolutism and equality. Catholicism and pluralism. The Enlightenment had offered questions. Now, revolution would offer answers, violent, final, and without appeal. And as Joseph's corpse was lowered into the crypt, the storm he'd feared arrived not in Vienna but in Paris. The old world was ending. And even the children of enlightenment would not survive it. He was a child of the Enlightenment, baptized in Latin, but raised on Voltaire. Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor, son of Maria Theresa, ruled not as a monarch, but as a philosopher in regalia, a reformer who believed the mind could conquer history, that logic could govern faith, and that empires could be healed by reason. But what happens when a mind outpaces its world? What if the empire you're trying to fix doesn't want to be fixed? Joseph admired the philosophes not in passing but religiously. He envisioned an empire transformed not by war, but by reformed decrees, legal codices, and enlightened paternalism. His reforms came fast. Too fast. He abolished serfdom, not with deliberation but by edict overnight. He closed over 700 monasteries, declaring them unproductive, and redirecting their wealth to state schools and hospitals. He introduced civil marriage, overhauled tax structures, imposed German as the administrative language, and sought to reduce the clergy to mere state servants. To Joseph, this was salvation, reason triumphing over tradition. To much of his empire, it was tyranny wrapped in Enlightenment silk. He ruled in the name of equality but consulted no one. He preached freedom but allowed no dissent. The Hungarians, proud and fiercely independent, rejected his language decrees and demanded their ancient rights. The Austrian nobility, stripped of feudal privileges, quietly sabotaged his reforms. Even the peasants, supposedly liberated, found themselves lost, free, yes, but without tools, without protection, without understanding. And perhaps most fatal of all, he never paused to listen. He ruled with paper. He governed by abstraction. He assumed that what worked on parchment would work in the blood-soaked soil of Bohemia, Galicia, or the Tyrol. But the Enlightenment was a mirror, not a blueprint. And Joseph's reforms, brilliant in theory, became unbearable in practice. What he imagined as light was experienced by his subjects as blinding, sudden, and foreign. He had tried to rationalize an irrational world, but an empire is not a laboratory. As the 1780s wore on, the emperor found himself increasingly isolated. Wars with the Ottoman Empire drained the treasury. Rebellions flared across the periphery. Even his own officials resisted his commands. Some ignored them. Others rewrote them. Many simply stalled, waiting for his death. His body, always frail, weakened. He toured hospitals he had built and was greeted with silent stares. The people he believed he'd freed saw only a stranger, an emperor who did everything for them, but nothing with them. Few rulers have been so ambitious, and yet so emotionally crushed by their own idealism. Joseph II died in 1790, before his 50th birthday. He left behind no heirs, no allies, no monuments, only reforms, most of which were repealed within months of his death. And yet, his fingerprints were everywhere. The school systems, the centralized bureaucracy, the idea that rulers must justify their existence through public welfare, not divine right, all of it endured in some form. He failed as a ruler, but succeeded as a ghost. In France, the Enlightenment would become revolution, and revolution would become blood. Joseph had tried to domesticate that fire. But fire does not bend. As Europe burned, his successors faced a question far more terrifying than reform. How do you keep a crown in an age that no longer believes in kings? Joseph II was buried with few mourners. But his failures refused to rest with him. Across the Habsburg Empire, from the salons of Vienna to the taverns of Prague, a new awareness stirred. One his policies had unintentionally planted. The people had begun to think for themselves. Not all supported revolution. But more and more they questioned the crown. What was the emperor if not divine? What was loyalty if not earned? And if reform was possible, why had it failed? The people Joseph tried to liberate found themselves adrift. They had been given rights, then stripped of the means to understand or use them. Their churches, once spiritual sanctuaries, were requisitioned. Their languages, once part of local pride, were repressed. Reform, it seemed, had come from above but never from within. And so the fracture widened. The peasants resented the bureaucracy. The nobility feared the Enlightenment. The clergy distrusted the state. In trying to please everyone, the crown had alienated them all. But while Austria wrestled with confusion, France screamed its answer. The guillotine did not just kill kings. It killed legitimacy. In 1793, Marie Antoinette, Maria Theresa's daughter, was beheaded in Paris. Her crime? Being royal. The image was unbearable to the Habsburg court. But what they feared more was that it made sense to so many. If Joseph's reforms had sown doubt, the French Revolution harvested rage. For the first time, the idea that monarchy itself was unnatural took hold in the Habsburg lands. Whispers turned into pamphlets, pamphlets into protests, and in secret, across the empire, the people began to imagine life without crowns at all. The fracture between the crown and its people was no longer philosophical. It was now military, territorial, existential. Napoleon Bonaparte, once an obscure artillery officer, had smashed the Austrian army, conquered Italy, and forced Francis II, Joseph's nephew, to surrender vast swaths of the empire. Austria no longer ruled the Holy Roman Empire in spirit. And soon it wouldn't rule it at all. The Habsburgs had long presented themselves as fathers to many nations. But now those nations began to ask, why should we obey a father who does not speak our name? The empire's subjects were no longer faceless peasants. They were Poles, Czechs, Slovenes, Croats, Hungarians, Germans, Italians, each with memory, tradition, pride. And as national identity rose, dynastic identity withered. The fracture was not just between crown and people. It was between the very idea of empire and the birth of the modern world. For centuries, the Holy Roman Empire had been neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire. Now it was nothing. Francis II, the last emperor, dissolved it with his own mouth. The crown passed into history. The dream of medieval unity collapsed into silence. And though he would remain Emperor of Austria, the people knew something had broken. and it would not be rebuilt. In France, the revolution came as fire. But in Vienna, it arrived as a rumor. Courtiers whispered, diplomats scribbled, and behind locked doors, emperors prayed. For over 800 years, the Habsburgs had watched dynasties rise and fall, kings be crowned and killed. They had survived crusades, plagues, reformations, and sieges. But what rose in Paris in 1789 was something new, a revolution not of armies, but of ideas. It didn't want to replace the king. It wanted to erase the very idea of kingship. And suddenly Vienna's palaces felt paper thin. They thought it would pass. A Parisian madness. A peasant tantrum. A fever that would break. Instead it spread. Like ink spilled across parchment, the revolution soaked the map of Europe. Monarchy itself was on trial, and the crowd, for once, was the judge. And in the shadows of Versailles, the Habsburg crown began to sweat. They responded not with reform but with retrenchment. Not with curiosity but condemnation. As their world unraveled, the Habsburgs tightened their corsets and spoke of divine right, as though ancient words could silence modern screams. In 1793, the Queen of France, the daughter of Maria Theresa, was beheaded by her own people. Her crime? Being Habsburg. Her sentence? History. Francis II, the new emperor, saw what the revolution meant. It wasn't just about thrones and taxes. It was about truth, power, identity, God. And in that moment, the Habsburgs saw themselves not as rulers but as prey. Then came Napoleon Bonaparte, the child of revolution, the destroyer of kings, and the unlikely mirror of the Habsburg soul. He wore no crown but demanded obedience. He was born without titles but wrote his own lineage. He crowned himself not by divine right, but by merit, blood, and iron. To the Habsburgs he was a villain and upstart, a usurper, a demon wrapped in ambition. But to many across Europe he was clarity incarnate, the man who tore down palaces to build nations. And so the Habsburgs fought. And lost. Again and again and again. For nearly a millennium, the Holy Roman Empire had limped across the pages of history, half dream, half bureaucracy. Now, with Napoleon's triumph, Francis II declared it dead. He crowned himself Emperor of Austria, instead a national title for a new kind of empire. It was a moment of reinvention. But it reeked of retreat. The Habsburgs had survived, but only by surrendering the very world they were born to rule. In the ashes of empire, order was redrawn. The Congress of Vienna, engineered by Austria's own Prince Metternich, sought to rewind history. Monarchs were restored. Borders were adjusted. Revolutions were declared accidents. And for a moment the world looked calm. But beneath that lacquer of diplomacy the floorboards creaked. Every map line ignored a language. Every border dismissed a culture. Every crown sat atop a boiling nation in waiting. They had killed the revolution's body but not its spirit. Could the Habsburgs restore order to a world that no longer believed in kings? Or were they merely redecorating a house already consumed by fire? Because far from Vienna, in the alleys of Budapest, the cafes of Prague, the guild halls of Milan, a different kind of future was being whispered into life. It didn't end in battle. It ended in paperwork. In the summer of 1806, after nearly 1,000 years, the Holy Roman Empire, that strange, ancient, half-imagined scaffolding of Europe, ceased to exist. No guns fired. No cities burned. No last stand. Just a signature. And a silence that echoed across the continent. Francis II, Emperor of Austria and last Holy Roman Emperor, stepped into a quiet chamber in Schönbrunn, and renounced the crown of Charlemagne. He had no choice, because across the Alps, Napoleon had remade the world. The so-called empire had long been more idea than authority, a patchwork of over 300 semi-sovereign states, ruled by electors, bishops, dukes, and free cities who owed allegiance to a crown they often ignored. Yet the fiction had value. It represented continuity, legitimacy, and Christendom itself. To abolish it was to admit something terrible. That order was no longer sacred. It was now something that could be rewritten by force. Napoleon understood this better than anyone. He knew that empires weren't just armies or laws, they were symbols. And symbols, once broken, do not heal. In 1805 at Austerlitz, Napoleon shattered the joint armies of Austria and Russia. It was the Habsburgs' worst defeat in a century. And within a year, Napoleon had forced the German princes to abandon the empire and form the Confederation of the Rhine, a puppet constellation of client states under his control. The old imperial crown, worn by Otto I, Frederick Barbarossa, Charles V, meant nothing now. And Francis knew it. On August 6, 1806, Francis II declared the Holy Roman Empire dissolved. In doing so, he became simply Francis I, Emperor of Austria, a newly invented title, narrower, more practical, but infinitely smaller in scope. It was a strategic retreat, a psychological decapitation of the medieval ideal of universal empire. Gone was the dream of a Europe united under one crown and one God. In its place, nations, codes, revolutions, and men who crown themselves. The old order hadn't just died. It had been out-evolved. To the common man, perhaps little changed. But to those who watched history with knowing eyes, it was seismic. For nearly 1,000 years, emperors had claimed to rule by the grace of God. Now the only grace left was whatever Napoleon allowed. The title Holy Roman Emperor became an artifact fit for museums, not mandates. And the Habsburgs, once heirs to Rome, defenders of Christendom, holders of Europe's sacred flame, had been reduced to just another dynasty with borders to defend. The Holy Roman Empire had been a contradiction. A beautiful one. A messy one. But for centuries, it had bound the fractured heart of Europe. Its fall left a vacuum not just of power, but of meaning. In that vacuum, nationalism would grow. In that vacuum, ideology would bloom. And in that vacuum, the world would stumble toward war. Empires don't die. They mutate. In 1806, Francis II did what no emperor before him had dared. He abolished the Holy Roman Empire, and with it, 1,000 years of ritual and illusion. But in that same breath he created something new, the Austrian Empire. Not holy, not Roman, but unquestionably his. It was the birth of a modern state born not from coronation, but from survival. The Holy Roman Empire had been a sprawling mosaic of cities, bishoprics, duchies, and elective titles. Now, Francis carved out the hereditary lands of the Habsburgs, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, Galicia, parts of Italy, and declared them a singular political unit, under one imperial crown, by right of blood and conquest. This was more than rebranding. It was a concession to modernity, an admission that empire now required definition, borders, bureaucracy, language, and law. The Holy Roman title had cloaked the Habsburgs in mysticism. But the Austrian Empire demanded policy. To rule such a vast, multi-ethnic, multilingual patchwork, Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, Croats, Italians, Slovenes, Germans, Francis needed more than tradition. He needed administration, military modernization, censorship mechanisms, legal harmonization. Above all, he needed control. Where Joseph II had tried reform through reason, Francis I now turned to reaction through regulation. In a way, the Austrian Empire was born already in conflict with itself. It sought to be a centralized monarchy, but ruled over people who had no desire to be centralized. Francis called himself Emperor of Austria. But to the Italians in Lombardy he was a foreigner. To the Magyars in Hungary, a tyrant. To the Czechs in Prague, a distant ghost. And yet, They were all subjects now. No longer estates. No longer provinces. Subjects of a modern state whether they understood it or not. Was this consolidation a stroke of genius? Or a ticking time bomb? Because while Francis had discarded the old imperial fiction, he had replaced it with something arguably more dangerous. A fragile structure held together by force. A mosaic painted over with one color. An empire pretending to be a nation. It looked clean on maps. It felt organized in ministries. But it was culturally combustible. And history would soon test just how much pressure the new empire could take. The Austrian Empire's new identity would be forged not just in structure but in ideology. At the Congress of Vienna, Austria presented itself as the anchor of European stability. No longer a medieval remnant but a modern arbiter of legitimacy. And at the center of it stood Metternich, architect of a system designed to stop time itself. Revolutions would be crushed. Borders would be sacred. Monarchs would reign. And Austria, newly born from the ashes, would become Europe's policeman. But here's the paradox. Austria became an empire in name, just as the world began to reject empire in principle. It was modern in structure, yet medieval in temperament. It boasted ministries and reforms, but feared the press, the university, the ballot box. It crowned emperors, but could no longer explain why they deserved to rule. Empires are not only won on battlefields. Sometimes they are rewoven around green baize tables. In 1815 the war against Napoleon ended. But the war for the soul of Europe had just begun. And at the center of that battle stood Austria, no longer the ghost of the Holy Roman Empire, but a newly declared imperial state with old ambitions and new anxieties. The venue? The Congress of Vienna. The goal? To undo a revolution without admitting the world had changed. Austria's prince diplomat, Clemens von Metternich, became the embodiment of Habsburg counter-revolution. Brilliant, suave, and deeply afraid of chaos, he believed that the Enlightenment had opened a door better left shut, that revolution, once unleashed, was a virus. His solution? Restore the old world. Repress the new. Wrap the future in velvet and lock it in the past. And in many ways he succeeded. The Congress of Vienna was a masterpiece of diplomacy, balancing punishment and preservation. France was not destroyed, merely tamed. The German states were reorganized into a German confederation, with Austria at its head. The Italian peninsula was chopped into client kingdoms, many under Habsburg control. And Poland? A compromise, split, diluted, pacified. The goal was simple: stability at any cost. And Austria crowned itself the guardian of that illusion. But what kind of peace was it? Metternich's system was not built on democracy or dialogue, it was built on containment. Censorship was reimposed. Universities were surveilled. The free press was strangled. Dissent was treated as disease. Austria styled itself the restorer of order. But to many within its own borders, Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Jews, liberals, dreamers, it became something else. The jailer of modernity. The Congress of Vienna had drawn clean lines on the map, but it had ignored the blood that still boiled beneath them. National identities had been awakened by Napoleon's fire. Now the Habsburgs sought to douse them in holy water and protocol. But you can't kill ideas with paperwork. You can only delay the reckoning. The Habsburgs had succeeded on paper. They had stitched Europe's monarchies back into place. But the threads were brittle. The seams strained. The tailors had never consulted the wearers. And across the empire, in secret and in silence, the people began to plot their own version of order. The Congress had ended the Napoleonic Wars. It had declared an age of peace. But it had also frozen history, and frozen things crack when they move again. For now, the Habsburgs stood tall, restorers of monarchy, defenders of tradition, center of the concert of Europe. But the music was beginning to shift. The next notes would not be written in ink but in fire. It looked like a wedding, but it felt like a divorce. In 1867, after centuries of domination, bloodshed, and silenced revolts, Hungary was finally granted equality with Austria. Not freedom, not independence, but something far more complicated. A compromise. And at the altar stood Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, now King of Hungary, one man wearing two crowns, presiding over an empire stitched together not with love, but with necessity. The Austro-Hungarian compromise was born from defeat. Just a year earlier, Austria had been humiliated by Prussia at the Battle of Königgrätz. Its dreams of leading a unified Germany were gone. Its army was bloodied, its coffers drained, its legitimacy shaken. And within the empire, the Hungarians, beaten but unbroken since their failed revolution of 1848, saw their chance. Austria needed help. Hungary demanded parity. The deal was struck. The empire would now become Austria-Hungary, a dual monarchy, two distinct states under one ruler, with separate parliaments, budgets, languages, and laws, but a shared foreign policy, military, and dynasty. It was ingenious, elegant, doomed. Franz Joseph was not a tyrant. He was a workaholic, a believer in duty, a man devastated by fate. He had ruled since 1848, when revolution nearly tore his empire apart. He had lost his brother to a firing squad in Mexico. His son, Crown Prince Rudolf, would soon die in a suicide pact. His wife, the famous Empress Elizabeth, had grown distant and restless. And now he ruled not one empire but two. He believed the compromise was a solution, but in truth it was a bandage on a beating wound. The new Austria-Hungary was not a nation. It was a multinational museum held together by nostalgia, inertia, and a monarchy that no longer inspired awe. Each group wanted recognition, some wanted autonomy, others wanted freedom. But only Hungary got the deal. Everyone else got promises. To the Czechs in Bohemia, the compromise was a betrayal. To the Slavs of the Balkans, it was proof they were invisible. To rising nationalist thinkers, it was the moment they realized the empire could bend, but only in two directions. The system that emerged was dazzlingly complex. Two parliaments, two capitals, shared ministers in foreign affairs, war, and finance. But two sets of schools, two railway systems, two currencies, two bureaucracies. It worked, on paper. But it made governance glacial. Crisis response? Paralyzed. Ethnic unrest? Ignored. Innovation? Filtered through dual committees, often vetoed by competing interests. The compromise created balance but at the cost of momentum. The empire now spoke in two tongues, but its other children, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Romanians, Ukrainians, had no voice at all. Franz Joseph believed he had postponed collapse. But he had only delayed the reckoning. The Habsburgs had survived centuries of war, faith, rebellion, and diplomacy. But now their greatest threat came not from emperors or invasions, but from poets, from students, from print shops in Prague and cafes in Belgrade, from dreams of nations, coiled like fused wire beneath the floorboards of Vienna. And somewhere far from court, a young man loads a pistol, and the heir to the empire boards a train to Sarajevo. He ruled for 68 years, longer than Napoleon, longer than Victoria, longer than any Habsburg before him. But for most of those years, Franz Joseph, I was alone, a monarch without joy, a husband without closeness, a father haunted by suicide, a ruler left standing as the world crumbled around him yet refusing to fall. History remembers Franz Joseph as stoic, but stoicism implies choice. In truth, His was a reign of endurance, a daily performance of duty so rigid, it resembled morning. Every morning began the same. Awake before dawn. Letters, orders, meetings, inspections, dinner alone, prayer, bed, repeat. For decades, even his handwriting, spidery and precise, never wavered, as if the emperor's script could hold together what politics no longer could. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, hated court life. She wandered through Europe, rarely returning. His only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, a bright but tortured idealist, killed himself in 1889, alongside his teenage mistress at Mayerling. The scandal shook the empire. The succession collapsed. Franz Joseph never spoke of it again. From that day forward, something in him hardened irreversibly. He dressed only in black. He wore mourning not as an act but as uniform. Yet even in grief he ruled. The world changed around him. Railways, socialism, photography, phonographs, telegraphs, revolutions, cars, tanks. But the emperor remained an 18th century man inside a 20th century empire. He trusted no one. He delegated power rarely. He believed in hierarchy, order, Catholic piety, and the sanctity of monarchy. When liberals demanded a constitution, he yielded but never believed in it. When ethnic groups demanded equality, he listened but rarely responded. His greatest political tool was delay. And in delay he endured. He became a living relic, a statue who signed decrees. Foreign observers admired his discipline. Subjects whispered reverence, even as they resented his silence. His personal motto? Viribus unitas, with united forces. But what force can unite Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Poles, Magyars, Italians, Ruthenians, Jews, Serbs, and Germans, when the only unity is obedience to a man who refuses to explain himself? To historians, Franz Joseph is a paradox. He did not believe in reform yet allowed his empire to modernize. He did not believe in emotion yet grieved perpetually. He did not create the dual monarchy but kept it alive through sheer inertia. In a time of anarchists and revolutionaries, industrialists and ideologues, Franz Joseph was not an answer. He was a delay button. A long pause between collapse and catastrophe. But his presence oddly worked. As long as he lived, the empire endured. Not proudly. Not peacefully. But together. His heir Archduke Franz Ferdinand believed in reform. He saw the cracks. He wanted change. But on June 28, 1914, as the emperor prepared for his morning routine, a telegram arrived. The Archduke is dead. Shot in Sarajevo. By a Bosnian Serb nationalist. In that moment the world stopped. And Franz Joseph, now 84 years old, was left with no son. No heir he understood. And no more time. The empire had survived wars, revolutions, assassinations, and grief. But what happens when the man holding it all together finally dies? It was the gunshot heard around the world. But for Austria-Hungary, it was the sound of 1,000 cracks breaking open at once. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne. It was meant to send a message to Vienna. Instead, it exposed a truth already pulsing beneath the imperial surface. This empire was not united. It was merely uncollapsed. Austria-Hungary was a mosaic of nations that no longer believed in the center. By the early 20th century, it ruled over more than 50 million people, speaking at least a dozen major languages. Its borders stretched from Bohemia to Bukovina, Dalmatia to Galicia, Trieste to Transylvania. And each of those peoples, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Poles, Ruthenians, Romanians, Jews, Germans, Italians, Magyars harbored a different grievance, a different dream, and most dangerously a different flag. The Compromise of 1867 had elevated Hungary. But what about everyone else? What about the Czechs in Prague demanding a voice? The Romanians in Transylvania longing for unity with Bucharest? The Serbs in Bosnia singing songs of freedom and martyrdom? The answer from Vienna was the same each time. Silence. Then paperwork. Then police. The Habsburgs called this policy administrative federalism. But for many inside the empire, it felt more like administrative suffocation. And the resentment festered. Not as open rebellion but as quiet rebellion. Folk songs that glorified outlaws and martyrs. Maps printed in secret. Newspapers published in dialects banned by censors. Children taught to say, "Our king," but never "our country." Unity was imposed but it was never felt. Then came World War I and with it, forced conscription, food shortages, mass surveillance and military crackdowns. The empire's response to crisis was not reform but repression. But you cannot conscript loyalty. And on every front Italian, Russian, Serbian, Romanian the imperial army fractured. Regiments deserted. Soldiers refused to fire. Nationalist slogans replaced oaths of loyalty. In 1916 Franz Joseph died. The emperor who had held it all together by sheer stubborn gravity was gone. His successor, Karl I, was young, idealistic, and tragically late. By 1918 the empire was not at war. It was in freefall. In Prague, Czechs declared independence. In Zagreb, Croats rejected Vienna and Budapest alike. In Lviv, Ukrainians proclaimed a republic. In Transylvania, Romanians broke away. In Galicia, the Poles raised their flag. And in Vienna, the ministers sat at polished tables, rewriting constitutions for a country that no longer existed. They called it a unifying structure. But it was a stage prop, collapsing between scenes. In the end, it wasn't the armies that undid the empire. It was the ideas it ignored. Ideas like self-determination, language rights, national pride, popular sovereignty. The empire had mistaken obedience for unity, and silence for consent. When the war came, those illusions vanished. And all that was left was the sound of borders redrawing themselves in fire and ink. In the ruins of the imperial capital, Vienna, one question remained. If the empire had failed to make its peoples feel heard, what new world would rise from their voices? It was the age of Strauss waltzes and psychoanalysis, of cafes that served revolution alongside whipped cream. Vienna, the imperial heart of the Habsburg world, had never looked more radiant. And yet, it had never been more hollow. This was the final paradox of the Habsburg Empire. While its institutions rotted, its culture soared. While its crown faded, its ideas burned with brilliance. While its soldiers bled on foreign soil, its artists reshaped the very soul of Europe. The empire was dying. But it was dying beautifully. The turn of the 20th century was Vienna's last golden bloom and autumn masquerading as spring. In art, Klimt, Schiele, and the Vienna Secession exploded traditional aesthetics. In music, Mahler, Bruckner, and Schönberg transformed harmony into haunting introspection. In thought, Freud dissected the unconscious while Wittgenstein questioned language itself. The city teemed with intellect, elegance, and the anxiety of knowing too much. From the grand opera houses to the shadowed lecture halls, Vienna had become the brain of Europe, even as its body withered from within. This golden age wasn't built on imperial strength. It was built on imperial denial. Franz Joseph's court still operated as if time had stopped. Etiquette trumped urgency. Rank overrode reform. In the Habsburg Palace, decisions were slow, suspicion was quick, and dissent was invisible, until it wasn't. The dual monarchy still printed maps with bold borders. But inside those borders, disillusionment metastasized. In Bohemia, Czech intellectuals demanded autonomy. In Hungary, nationalists toyed with the idea of separate diplomacy. In Galicia, Jewish thinkers wrote in Yiddish, Polish, and German, but felt loyal to none. Vienna, in all its brilliance, refused to hear them. What made this era so tragic and so brilliant was the contradiction. While imperial policy stagnated, imperial society evolved at breakneck speed. The empire's children, painters, poets, composers, dreamers could feel the scaffolding cracking. And so they created, not to save the empire, but to outlive it. They knew something the emperor did not, that you can silence protests, but you cannot silence doubt, that you can ban the printing of radical manifestos, but you cannot ban ideas whose time has come. Vienna's golden age was not the proof of an empire's health. It was its eulogy read aloud by minds that had already left the palace behind. And when the guns of World War I stopped, so did the music. By 1918 the empire was no more. Franz Joseph was dead. His successor, Karl I, exiled. The crown unclaimed. The palace abandoned. The statues silent. But Vienna remained, not as a capital of an empire, but as a memory of what an empire thought it could be, and what it failed to become. As monarchs fell and borders dissolved, a new Europe emerged, modern, fractured, and haunted by what it once nearly was. The age of empires was over, but the age of ideology had just begun. The bullet struck Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the neck. His wife, Sophie, was hit in the abdomen. They died side by side. But that bullet didn't just kill a couple. It fractured a world. In that split second, 600 years of Habsburg rule began to dissolve. The headlines would scream of alliances, ultimatums, mobilizations. But inside the Habsburg Empire, the story was far more intimate, and far more tragic. What followed wasn't a clean collapse. It was a slow, painful unraveling. As war erupted across Europe, Austria-Hungary, a patchwork of 15 languages and 11 nationalities, found itself fighting not just external enemies but itself. Mutinies broke out in Galicia. Peasant revolts roared through the Balkans. Soldiers in the trenches refused orders because they couldn't understand them. The imperial army bled from within, from men who no longer knew who they were fighting for, or why. Famine swept through the empire. In Vienna, once the jewel of Europe, rats replaced meat in stew pots. In Bohemia, factory strikes turned into nationalist demonstrations. In Trieste, Italians cheered their country's invasion. In Lviv, Ukrainians began flying their own colors. The empire had not yet lost the war, but it had already lost its people. What united them was no longer loyalty to a distant emperor, but hunger, resentment, and the sense that their own future lay elsewhere. In the middle of the storm, a new emperor rose. Charles I, young, handsome, Catholic, a war hero, a husband, a father, and to many the last chance to save the empire. But he came too late. Charles I was a man of letters in a world of gunpowder. He tried diplomacy, secret notes to the Allies, back-channel peace offers, half-promises to minority leaders. He begged for peace, even as his generals promised victory. He toured hospitals, kissed wounded soldiers, prayed in public. But goodness could not reverse entropy. The world had turned. And no emperor, however noble, could persuade it to turn back. By 1918 the empire had vanished in everything but name. Hungary had seceded. Czechoslovakia had declared independence. Yugoslavia was being born. Poland reclaimed its heartbeat. Romania swept into Transylvania. And in Vienna, there was no army left to stop them. No loyalty to call upon. No food. No future. On November 11th, as the war ended, Charles I issued a proclamation. He would not abdicate. but he would withdraw from public affairs. In other words, he was emperor of nothing. He left Vienna without ceremony. No soldiers. No brass bands. No crowds. Just a suitcase, and the weight of 600 years fading into fog. In exile, Charles wrote letters. Pleased to return. Dreams of restoration. A final gasp of belief. But no one was listening. And somewhere in a museum in Switzerland, the Habsburg crown lay behind glass. Forgotten. For now. The empire was dead. But its ghosts would not rest. From fascists to nostalgists, rebels to royals, the 20th century would carry the Habsburg legacy like a relic, or a warning. In the opening days of World War I, Austria-Hungary believed it could deliver a quick blow, a punitive strike against Serbia, whom it blamed for the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But that was the last time the war made sense. What followed wasn't a march to victory. It was a slow-motion autopsy of an empire not built to survive modern war. The Austro-Hungarian Empire entered the war with a 19th century mind and an 18th century structure. But the 20th century would show no mercy. Its army was vast but unwieldy, made up of dozens of ethnicities, most of whom barely understood one another, let alone the commands issued by their superiors. Germans gave orders in Prussian tones. Croats translated them poorly. Ruthenians and Czechs ignored them entirely. Weapons were outdated. Tactics were obsolete. And morale was already cracked before the first bullet flew. On the Eastern Front, they were humiliated by Russia at the Battle of Lemberg. In the Carpathians, they froze to death in blizzards. More men died of exposure than enemy fire. In Serbia, their invasion faltered repeatedly, despite overwhelming numbers. The army's great flaw wasn't just military. It was structural, a microcosm of the empire itself. Officers distrusted their men. Units mutinied. Desertion rates soared. And as bodies piled up, a question echoed across the front. Why are we dying for Vienna? It was a war of misunderstandings. Not just of battlefield confusion, but of imperial blindness. Vienna believed it was defending the empire. But it was defending a fantasy, a world that no longer existed, if it ever had. By 1915, food riots had begun in Budapest. By 1916, strikes paralyzed Prague and Brno. By 1917, the army was forcing children into uniform. And by 1918, soldiers no longer knew what flag to salute. In the final months, entire regiments mutinied, not against a foreign enemy, but against the very concept of empire. Charles I, the young emperor, still hoped. He prayed. He wrote. He offered reforms and federalization. Too late. The empire wasn't bleeding. It was drained. Romania invaded Transylvania. Italy seized the Tyrol. Czechs, Serbs, Slovaks, and Croats formed independent councils. And the Allies, seeing the cracks, began to promise nations in exchange for loyalty. Nationalism was now a weapon. And it was one the empire could no longer fight. The Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't lose World War I in a single battle. It lost it in thousands of quiet betrayals. A Czech soldier refusing to fire. A Hungarian officer ignoring a command. A Ruthenian farmer feeding deserters. A Slovene priest whispering revolution in a confessional. It lost it in letters censored, rations spoiled, flags hidden, oaths muttered with no meaning. By the time the armistice came, the empire hadn't just lost the war. It had lost its people's belief in it. The treaties would follow. The maps would change. Monarchs would fall. But the deeper story of what it meant to build a world on diversity without unity was only just beginning. The Austro-Hungarian Empire did not collapse like a tower struck by lightning. It disintegrated piece by piece, nerve by nerve, truth by truth, until there was nothing left to call a whole. And when it ended, there was no official notice. Just silence. And then flags. New ones. Different ones. All waving not in defiance but relief. The empire had always called itself a union of peoples. But it was never a union built on consent. It was built on paper, etiquette, and exclusion and elegant bureaucracy that floated over lives it barely understood. As World War I dragged on, that paper became soaked in blood. And when it tore, the pieces drifted off with surprising speed. On October 28, 1918, Czechoslovakia declared its independence, its leaders in Prague throwing open the windows of government buildings while students sang in the streets. On October 29, a new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes announced itself, hoping to shape a pan-Slavic future from the bones of Habsburg control. On November 1, Hungary severed ties with Austria, its parliament burning imperial seals and resurrecting its own crown not as a partner, but as a nation reborn. In Galicia, Poles reclaimed territory they had not ruled since the partitions. In Transylvania, Romanians declared union with Bucharest. Even Ruthenians, long stateless and voiceless, attempted to carve out autonomy from the wreckage. This was not revolution. This was reclamation, a political reckoning delayed for generations. The Habsburgs had ruled by pretending that time could be stopped. But nationalism, literacy, and modern warfare had turned that illusion into a curse. In each newly independent capital, governments formed with stunning urgency, as if they'd been preparing for years. Because they had. Beneath the Habsburg flag, newspapers had quietly printed in outlawed languages. Teachers had taught banned histories. Families had passed on national anthems as bedtime lullabies. When the empire faltered, those suppressed memories erupted into political form. And what of Vienna, once the heartbeat of this empire? It was now a city without a country. No more empire. No more colonies. No more first among equals. Just a small Austrian republic, shrunken, bankrupt, and adrift. The Habsburgs themselves were banned. Their property seized. Their names cursed. And their last emperor, Charles I, exiled to Madeira where he would die young, coughing and broke, praying not for restoration but for meaning. In the winter of 1918, a poem was published in Prague. Read, "We were never ruled. We were always waiting. Now we wake." That, perhaps, was the true verdict on the empire. It hadn't fallen. It had been slept through by rulers who mistook quiet for peace, and who could not hear the ticking of the future beneath the hush of ceremony. But disintegration is never the end. It is a beginning jagged, bloody, and full of ghosts. What came after Austria-Hungary wasn't peace. It was a dozen experiments in identity, sovereignty, and revenge. And in the ruins, new monsters stirred. This is how the Habsburg story ends. Not with assassination. Not with abdication. Not with glory. But with a single breath, taken in exile on an island far from power, and even farther from memory. This is the story of Charles I, the last emperor. A man born to rule a world already dying and crowned amid the rubble. Charles ascended the throne in 1916, during the dark middle of the Great War. He was young, devout, and sincere, qualities rarely associated with the Habsburg throne by then. He didn't drink. He didn't keep mistresses. He wrote to his wife every day. He kissed the hands of wounded soldiers. He wept during Mass. But the world no longer cared for such emperors. It wanted statesmen, negotiators, survivors, and Charles was none of these. From the moment of his coronation, Charles tried to pull the empire back from the brink. He proposed secret peace talks with the Allies, the Sixtus Affair, but they failed when Italy demanded too high a price, and Austria had nothing left to offer. He tried to federalize the empire to grant autonomy to Slavs, Czechs, and Croats, but his ministers sabotaged him, and nationalist leaders saw his reforms as too little, too late. He tried to revive Catholic legitimacy, but the people now believed in republics, in parliaments, in voices of their own. He was a man of good intentions, but history does not reward good intentions. In 1919, Charles was officially dethroned. Not by a firing squad. Not by a coup. But by a document. He did not abdicate. He believed kings were crowned by God, not dismissed by men. But he withdrew. And he waited. And the world moved on without him. Twice he attempted a restoration in Hungary. Twice he failed. The second time he arrived by plane like a character from a political fairy tale. But the regent, Miklos Horthy, blocked his return. The army refused to support him. Even priests turned him away. He was escorted from the parliament building like an intruder. Like a man without a country or a century. In Madeira, Charles lived in a rented villa. The roof leaked. The food was poor. His children fell ill. And then he did. In 1922, at age 34, he succumbed to pneumonia. He died penniless, powerless, and praying for the empire that no longer existed. His final words? "I must suffer, so that my peoples may come together again." But they didn't. They scattered. They fought. And eventually they forgot. With Charles's death, the Habsburg line lost not just a throne, but a meaning. For centuries, Habsburg rule had been draped in the language of providence, duty, and destiny. But now the divine right of kings was reduced to a legal fiction. A relic. A museum piece. A name in a footnote. And yet, ideas don't die so easily. In the vacuum left behind, new ideologies rose: fascism, nationalism, totalitarianism. And as Europe stumbled toward a second war, some would long not for freedom, but for order and for crowns, even broken ones. The empire is gone. The throne is dust. The crown sits behind glass. And yet, the Habsburgs are still here. Not in palaces of power, but in palaces of memory. And sometimes memory is more dangerous than rule. After the collapse of 1918, the Habsburg family scattered like shattered porcelain. They were banned from Austria. Their property confiscated. Their names erased from official seals, royal hymns, and legal precedent. Some fled to Switzerland, others to Spain, Germany, or the Madeira coast where Charles I died coughing in exile. But they never renounced their name. And the world never stopped whispering it. Letters passed in secret among exiles between Paris salons and Portuguese convents. Stories told to children who never saw the empire. Crimson sashes kept in trunks beside rationed soap and second-hand coats. In these fragments, the myth was preserved. And myths, unlike monarchs, are immortal. By the 1950s, Austria had stabilized as a republic. But Vienna never fully let go of the crown it had buried. Schönbrunn became a museum. Habsburg Palace, a cultural center. Habsburg portraits returned to gallery walls. The public began to speak of die gute alte Zeit, the good old days. Suddenly, nostalgia sold tickets. And the same halls that once housed sovereigns now hosted school children, violin concerts, and souvenir shops. The empire had become a tourist attraction. But what happens when an empire becomes a performance? What is empire really? A crown? A language? A territory? Or is it something older, a dream, seeded into architecture, music, etiquette, and fear? The Habsburgs are studied, yes. But they are also longed for in subconscious ways, by those who miss order, identity, unity. They are remembered as ghosts of stability, even though their empire collapsed under its own contradictions. That's the trick with vanished power. It's easier to love when it's no longer dangerous. And the Habsburgs themselves? They never disappeared entirely. Otto von Habsburg, son of Charles I, became a member of the European Parliament advocating democracy in the name of a family that once claimed divine right. Other descendants live quietly in Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. Some historians, some socialites, some simply forgotten. They are no longer kings. But they are living metaphors, reminders that even broken dynasties leave shadows that stretch long across the modern world. The Habsburgs died in 1918. But their story didn't. It migrated into paintings, postcards, nostalgia, and even politics. In an age of rising nationalism, cultural nostalgia, and populist myth-making, one must ask, can an empire truly die? Or do some kingdoms simply fall asleep in history's memory, waiting to be remembered, reinterpreted, or resurrected? They ruled a world that no longer exists. But perhaps, the world hasn't finished dreaming about them. When an empire dies, it doesn't rot. It crystallizes. And in that frozen form, it becomes something far more dangerous than power. It becomes a story. For modern Austria and for much of Central Europe, the Habsburgs have become a myth of lost grandeur, remembered not as rulers of contradiction, but as symbols of elegance, peace, and civilization. This is imperial nostalgia, a longing for something that never fully existed, but feels true in hindsight. We see it in the marble-lipped memoirs of aristocrats who describe the twilight years before 1914 as the last beautiful days. We hear it in the melancholy strains of Strauss waltzes, in the delicate brushstrokes of Klimt's golden women, in the soft glow of candlelit portraits lining palace museums. And we feel it in the romanticized films about Empress Elizabeth, the Sisi of silver screen myth, graceful, misunderstood, tragic, perfect. But Sisi was also depressive, anorexic, and politically disengaged. And the empire she wandered through was bleeding at its seams. The image survives not because it was true but because it comforts. Nostalgia smooths edges. It edits. It turns autocracy into elegance. It paints bureaucracy as benevolence. It reframes inequality as charm. And yet, when modern Europeans feel adrift amid globalization, cultural fragmentation, political polarization, many reach not for radical futures, but for polished pasts. Not just in Austria but across Hungary, Slovakia, Czechia, and even Italy, there are murmurs. At least under the empire we were part of something bigger. At least there was order. At least we belonged. They forget the censorship, the class barriers, the ethnic silencing, the wars, the stagnation. Memory lies, but it lies sweetly. In recent years, even scholars and politicians have flirted with Habsburg nostalgia. Some admire the empire's multilingual tolerance, forgetting that tolerance often meant suppression without bloodshed. Others romanticize the shared postal systems, universities, and civil codes, ignoring who wrote those codes, and who they excluded. Still others hold up the Habsburgs as a countermodel to nationalism, imagining a Europe bound by law, not identity. But a Europe ruled from palaces is no more just than one ruled from barricades. And the Habsburg model, elegant, imperial, and above all hierarchical, was built on a world that no longer exists. Yet nostalgia persists. Because nostalgia is not about truth. It's about grief. Grief for things lost, uncertain, or never found stability, unity, beauty, a sense of place in the world. When modern life feels fractured, some look back and see the empire not as it was, but as they needed to have been. And in the hush of old palaces, the memory obliges. The Habsburgs are gone. But their world, gleaming and broken, still casts its spell. Because in the end, we don't miss the empire. We miss the illusion that someone, somewhere, once had control. And if myths are more powerful than facts, then maybe the Habsburgs never really fell. Maybe they just became the story we tell ourselves when the present feels too fragile to bear. The Habsburgs no longer reign. But in Austria, Hungary, and Spain they remain curiously present, not in law but in language, architecture, ceremony, and memory. It is not a question of whether they are missed. It is a question of how they are used. Because legacy, like empire, is not neutral. It is inherited, shaped, contested. In modern Austria, the republic was built atop the ruins of the dynasty. The 1919 Habsburg law exiled the imperial family and stripped them of property and titles. And yet today Austria sells the empire it overthrew. Palaces like Schönbrunn and the Hofburg are now cultural capital curated as icons of Austrian sophistication. Coffee houses preserve imperial etiquette. The Vienna Philharmonic plays Strauss beneath chandeliers funded by centuries of colonial gold and noble taxes. Publicly, Austrians pride themselves on republican democracy. Privately, many still say Kaiserlich, imperial, as a synonym for excellence. It's not quite longing. It's not quite denial. It's something subtler, aesthetic nationalism without the politics. But nostalgia in Austria is largely performative. In Hungary it becomes political. Here, the memory of the dual monarchy is woven tightly into national identity. Conservatives point to the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867 as a golden age when Hungary stood as equal to Austria, with its own flag, crown, and parliament. Today, politicians invoke that past not to restore monarchy but to revive the dignity of a greater Hungary. One that included parts of Slovakia, Romania, Serbia, lands once under Habsburg Hungarian control. In Hungarian schoolbooks, maps of pre-World War I borders still appear. Not as lessons in loss but as quiet provocations. And the crown of Saint Stephen once worn by Habsburg kings is now enshrined in the Hungarian parliament, not as a relic, but as a constitutional symbol. The monarchy is gone. But the idea of Hungary as the soul of Central Europe that remains. And it is shaped, in part, by Habsburg scaffolding. In Spain the legacy takes yet another shape. It was the marriage of Philip of Habsburg to Joanna of Castile that brought the dynasty southward. And for a century Spain was ruled from both Madrid and Vienna, its ships flying under the Catholic Empire's double-headed eagle. Today, while Spain remembers its Bourbon kings, the Habsburg era holds a unique place. As the crucible of the Spanish Golden Age. Under Habsburg monarchs like Charles V and Philip II, Spain claimed the Americas, expanded into Italy and the Low Countries, and became the global center of Catholic orthodoxy. Modern Spanish conservatives often reference this period as one of unity, divine mission, and national prestige. Ironically, it was also a period of inquisition, economic decline, and cultural centralization. And yet, in Spanish film, literature, and national myth, the Habsburg court is remembered with moody reverence as a time when Spain still believed it had a sacred purpose in the world. Each country, Austria, Hungary, Spain, remembers the Habsburgs differently. To some they are a mirror. To others a mask. To a few a warning. But in each, their legacy is not confined to history books. It lives in buildings, language, rituals, and sometimes in policy. This isn't about restoring crowns. It's about restoring a sense of order, one that people believe once existed, whether it did or not. In a fragmented, globalized world, there is comfort in the idea that someone once ruled who knew what they were doing. Even if that someone ruled by accident, inheritance, or divine decree. The irony, of course, is that the Habsburgs never truly controlled the forces they unleashed: religion, nationalism, modernity. But modern Europeans still walk beneath their shadows. And if nostalgia makes myths, and myths guide nations, then the Habsburg legacy may yet outlive the dynasty itself. Because some empires die once. Others die every time we remember them. There are no more emperors. But there are plenty of thrones. In Vienna, in Budapest, in Madrid, the palaces still stand not as centers of command, but as temples of memory. And each year millions pass through their doors not to bow, but to remember. Or at least to pretend. Tourism is not neutral. It is a form of pilgrimage. Not to saints or gods but to stories we want to believe. And monarchy, especially the gilded, doomed, Baroque flavor of the Habsburgs, is among the most seductive stories of all. Velvet, marble, mirrors, melancholy. The illusion of control. The fantasy of elegance. It promises a past without uncertainty even if that past never existed. Palaces today are stage sets but their script was written by power. Everything about them whispers obedience. The symmetry, the portraits, the silk-covered thrones. Yet now we wander them with audio guides and headphones, sipping iced coffees in courtyards where peasants once knelt. We photograph tragedy. We monetize memory. We post selfies where secrets were whispered and wars decided. This is monarchy stripped of teeth but painted in gold. It no longer commands but it still captivates. But why? Why, in republics and democracies, do so many yearn for the aesthetic of rule? Because the mythology of monarchy speaks to something beneath politics, something timeless. The desire for meaning, order, identity, permanence. Monarchs may fail, but their palaces endure. Their uniforms still impress. Their symbols still stir. And in an age of fast news, disposable culture, and rising chaos, the idea of monarchy offers an illusion of rootedness. Even if that root system is built on blood, repression, and delusion. The more distant monarchy becomes, the more innocent it seems. We forget the war rooms. We remember the ballroom. We forget the starvation outside palace gates. We remember the gowns. But the gowns were political. The halls were hierarchies. The gold was extracted, not earned. Still, palaces don't teach that. They're not designed to. They are designed to awe, enchant, confuse. To make us feel small, and somehow comforted by it. What we consume as history is often architecture without context. But bricks remember. Every staircase has heard boots. Every corridor has felt footsteps of fear. And still we walk them without hearing the echoes. That is the final genius of the Habsburg legacy. To survive not as rulers but as decor. To let the empire dissolve while its image grows immortal. The Habsburgs no longer rule. But they are curated, copied, adored. Their world was flawed, brutal, beautiful. And now it's open daily from 10 to 6. So ask yourself, when we walk through their halls, are we honoring history or escaping our own? What is a dynasty? Is it a bloodline? A crown? A building? A story? The Habsburgs were all of these. But more than that, they were a living experiment in how far identity can stretch before it shatters. For over 600 years they ruled without pause. They spanned from the Atlantic to Transylvania, from Flemish cities to Filipino colonies. They governed popes and peasants, princes and heretics. But for all their power they were never quite in control. And that is their greatest lesson. That power, even imperial power, is always borrowed, conditional, fragile, and most dangerous when it pretends to be eternal. The Habsburgs taught us that control is performed, not possessed. That legitimacy is a ritual, not a right. And that even the grandest empire can outlive its usefulness, but not its illusion. They also teach us about identity. The Habsburgs ruled not by annihilating difference but by containing it, by folding dozens of ethnicities, languages, faiths into a loose, uneasy whole. Not unity but coexistence. That experiment ultimately failed. But its echoes remain in the European Union, in post-imperial cities, in contested memories. Today, when the world fractures into us and them, the Habsburg story asks, what if identity isn't about purity, but about management of difference? What if stability comes not from sameness, but from delicately balanced contradiction? They didn't always manage it well, but they tried, and that attempt still matters. And finally, time. The Habsburgs didn't just live through history, They embodied it. Their coats of arms absorbed kingdoms long extinct. Their calendars marked holy days and revolutions. Their genealogies ran backward into myth, forward into war. They made memory a political weapon. They bent time into spectacle. And yet, for all their titles and pageants, they could not escape it. Time caught them like it catches everyone. A bullet in Sarajevo. A signature in Versailles. An empty bed in Madeira. A crown behind glass. They ruled for centuries. But in the end, they vanished almost overnight. The Habsburgs teach us that no empire is forever. That even the most ornate system, if built on fear and inertia, will rot from within. But they also teach us that memory survives ruin. That myths outlast monarchs. That power, though it fades, leaves fingerprints. And perhaps most haunting of all, they remind us that we are not so different. That we too build systems, craft identities, believe in permanence, ignore the cracks, and wonder why everything feels familiar. The Habsburgs are gone, but their world is not, because history doesn't vanish. It waits, sleeps, echoes, and sometimes it returns in ways we no longer recognize. They began as mountain knights, anonymous, forgotten, irrelevant. A family with no name, no future, only ambition. They built a castle, then a marriage, then a throne, then the world. For 6 centuries, the Habsburgs walked across maps like gods, ruling over deserts and oceans, reformers and reactionaries, saints and monsters. But in truth, they never ruled the world. They survived it. We watched them claw out of obscurity with Rudolph, trade vows like weapons with Maximilian, break under the weight of a crumbling world with Charles V, set oceans aflame with Philip II, withstand cannon fire and whisper through palace corridors during the Siege of Vienna. We saw Maria Theresa give birth to reforms and to 16 children. Saw Joseph II try to outthink fate and fail. Saw Napoleon dance across their graves, and Franz Joseph watch his family die one by one. And we watched a gunshot in Sarajevo bring it all down. But the Habsburgs didn't just die. They dissolved into myth. And isn't that the real power? To be mourned by republics that overthrew them. To be remembered in marble even when their empire ended in famine, bureaucracy, and silence. To be mythologized not as what they were but what we need them to have been. The illusion of order. The fantasy of unity. The mask of permanence. Because deep down we don't long for emperors. We long for certainty. And in the chaos of now, in the disinformation, the polarization, the noise, the Habsburg story whispers, there was once a time when someone knew what they were doing. Even if that too is a lie. They ruled with paperwork, portraits, and pageantry. They died with whispers, letters, and exile. But maybe they didn't vanish. Maybe they just changed costume. Because this was never just about one family. This was about how we build myths out of marble. How we mistake inheritance for legitimacy. How power endures even when the palaces are museums. And maybe, just maybe, no empire ever truly ends. Those who forget the past may repeat it. But those who mythologize it may never escape it. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching history. You're living with its ghosts. So ask yourself, what did we inherit from this empire? What illusions still rule us? If the answers haunt you, then subscribe because we're not done unearthing the past. There are more forgotten kingdoms, more unburied truths, more lies dressed in gold. And if you won't subscribe, tell us why in the comments. The emperors are gone, but the debate? That never ends. To all who walked with us through 10 hours of empire, decay, and memory, thank you. History remembers those who remember it.